Thank you so much for joining us for CBN News Watch. I'm Efrem Graham. Ahead today, Vladimir Putin upping the pressure as he moves Russian troops into areas of Ukraine as the U.S. and European allies are still looking for a diplomatic solution. In Israel, some took a cue from the Canadian COVID restrictions protest convoy and held their own protests. Plus, best-selling author Bertice Berry wrote Redemption Song and named the villain after a real man.
Old man Hun wasn't so old then. He was out hunting my mama and me. He wasn't a real catcher. Others caught slaves for money. He caught them for keeps.
See why she believed he was the man who enslaved her ancestors, but soon realized she was in error. Then later, we'll show you why this couple stepped out on faith in order to spread the gospel.
We had that hope set before us. The work was worth it, even though it was exhausting, because we knew what God was calling us to by way of freedom.
All these stories and more are coming up next from the CBN Newsroom.
This is CBN News Watch.
We begin this half hour with Vladimir Putin ordering Russian troops into 2 breakaway regions of Ukraine, and he's claiming Russian recognition of those regions, which includes territory still held by Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, the U.S. is convinced a full-scale invasion attack is coming. All American diplomats in Ukraine have moved to Poland for their safety, while President Joe Biden urged Ukraine's president to flee Kyiv. Jenna Browder has the story now from Washington.
Putin's recognition of the breakaway territories followed by Russian troops is being met with global condemnation. The U.S. has already imposed some sanctions, and more are expected today.
We are going to be imposing significant sanctions on Russia.
Overnight, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, calling the move a clear attack on Ukraine's sovereignty.
This move by President Putin is clearly the basis for Russia's attempt to create a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. He has since announced that he will place Russian troops in these regions. He calls them peacekeepers. This is nonsense. We know what they really are.
Russia now says its recognition of independence extends even to Ukraine-held parts of those eastern territories. Satellite images show Russian forces now less than 6 miles from the border. CBN's George Thomas on the ground in Lviv, Ukraine.
Putin has at least 3 options right now. One, he can take the next couple of days and assess how the Ukrainians as well as the international community respond. 2, he can create these so-called false flag operations, accusing the Ukrainians of trying to attack his forces that would give him the pretext to launch a larger invasion into the east. Or 3, he can launch an imminent full-scale invasion and take the entire 2 provinces and then set his sights on Kyiv.
The White House urging Ukraine's President Zelensky to leave for his own safety. In a video posted to social media overnight, Zelensky urging calm and saying his citizens are strong and ready. Meanwhile, the UN ambassador is calling Putin's actions a threat to global stability. Oil prices nearing $100 a barrel Tuesday, the highest in 7 years. Today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is expected to meet with Ukraine's foreign minister. And the 27-nation European Union is also standing with the U.S. and NATO and pledging harsher sanctions against Russia. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Turning now to Canada, where lawmakers voted last night to extend the emergency powers that police can invoke to quell any potential restart of blockades by those opposed to COVID-19 restrictions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said earlier in the day the powers were still needed despite police ending the occupation of the nation's capital by truckers over the weekend and ending border blockades before that.
But even though the blockades are lifted across border openings right now, even though things seem to be resolving very well in Ottawa, this state of emergency is not over.
Streets in Canada's capital of Ottawa are quiet now after some clashes over the weekend between police and the protesters. The Emergencies Act allows authorities to declare certain areas a no-go zone. It also allows police to freeze truckers' personal and corporate bank accounts and compel tow truck companies to haul away vehicles. Some have accused Trudeau of going too far and engaging in government overreach. Some in Israel took a cue from the Canadian trucker protest. Israelis upset about COVID restrictions and what they see as laws interfering on their freedom. They say are regrouping after most restrictions were dropped last week and police took down their tents. Earlier, they had 2 convoys to Jerusalem last week. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl was out on the streets of Jerusalem to hear what they were saying.
While they may not have blocked bridges or trade, thousands of vehicles across Israel traveled to Jerusalem for the first day of this protest. While it started small, numbers grew by evening.
Behind me are a couple of hundred protesters outside the Israeli Knesset. They're part of what's being called the Freedom Convoy. Thousands of Israelis are coming up to Jerusalem to protest what they say is a violation of their democratic rights.
We're citizens. We care about this country, and we're fed up with all the craziness here. We decided we want to return our lives to ourselves.
Demonstrators want legislation dubbed the coronavirus law repealed. Passed in January as part of ending the pandemic state of emergency, it also gives the government power to reimpose restrictions if it deems necessary, including the Green Pass, which limits access for the unvaccinated. In a statement, the Constitution Committee chairman says the law would enable a transition to a special health situation in which there's a more appropriate balance between protecting our fundamental rights and the need to prevent harm to the public's health. Legal expert Professor Eugene Kontorovich explains why some are wary.
It's scary and it institutionalizes a system for rapidly imposing COVID restrictions with a kind of sense that the COVID situation is not gone, but that we're going to be in a permanent COVID quasi-emergency that can trigger an emergency right away. It's not scary in that it actually in some ways increases Knesset supervision, but the question is what's going to happen in practice.
Commentator Avi Abelo says the Israeli public doesn't want the government to have emergency powers to suddenly impose restrictions.
Many of Israelis are waking up and finally being vocal about wanting to get back to a normal where government is not running our lives, where our medical information can once again be private, when there's no more coercion of medical procedures.
We want to cancel the imaginary emergency situation law. We don't have an emergency situation here.
For the freedom, for the sake of the future of our children and for today. There is something suspicious about everything that's going on.
Motorists came from some 40 different locations. Others stood on bridges, overpasses, and along roads cheering them on.
I'm here to join this movement, which is a movement for freedom. I just want to be counted as one who did something and not just sat at home.
I'm very much in favor of democracy in our country, and we've lost that completely. We have to fight to return to our freedom.
The situation in the country is simply lousy. It's good that you're here today because the media in Israel doesn't cover these protests.
Reuven Doron, a Messianic believer, has been leading a prayer vigil outside the Knesset for months.
We are here today praying that our government will listen to the cries of the people, that our government will take notice from other experts other than their own internal committees and deliberations, but will listen to the bigger story and give the people a break.
Convoy organizers say they plan to keep up the protest until the law is repealed and the rights they feel they have lost are restored. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Former President Donald Trump's social media platform Truth Social officially launched Sunday night and was listed as the top free app in Apple stores by early Monday. Trump had been working to develop his own social media site after he was banned from Twitter and Facebook last year. The platform's website describes it as America's Big Ten, a social media platform that encourages an open, free, and honest global conversation without discriminating against political ideology. Reuters reports the demand to download the app was so high, some users had problems registering for an account or were added to a wait list with the message, "Due to massive demand, we have placed you on our wait list." The wait list reached well more than 200,000 people. Singer Jane Marczewski has lost her battle with cancer, dying at the age of 31. She was a Christian who went by the name Nightbird. She left Liberty University and not long after that developed breast cancer. She was certain she had beat it, and she did, even releasing a song about it in 2019 called Girl in a Bubble. That's the video music you're seeing right there. But the cancer came back and spread, and her husband walked out on her. But she made it big on America's Got Talent. Her audition on that show has now been viewed more than 40 million times. Nightbird died Saturday at her home in California. You can read more about her life at cbnnews.com. Dr. Bertice Berry believed that the man who enslaved her ancestors, John Hunn, owned them.
I knew the story. I heard the name that he owned the plantation that our family lived on during slavery.
But see why what she believed has now become her greatest error. Stay with us. Best-selling author Bertice Berry was convinced that a man named John Hunn enslaved her ancestors. She even vilified him in one of her novels. And then she discovered the truth. Charlene Aaron shows us how Bertice Berry set the record straight.
By most accounts, Dr. Bertice Berry has led a successful life. Born in poverty, she earned a PhD, became a nationally syndicated talk show host, and best-selling author. Along the way, though, she made what she calls one of her greatest errors.
You would bring it up. Yeah. You would bring it up.
In her novel, Redemption Song, she names her villain an evil slaveholder after a real man, John Hunn.
Old man Hunn wasn't so old then. He was out hunting my mama and me. He wasn't a real catcher. Others caught slaves for money. He caught them for keeps. John Hunn, I knew the story. I heard the name that he owned the plantation that our family lived on during slavery.
Despite her mother's repeated objections, Dr. Berry believed Hunn owned her ancestors.
Especially in the 60s and 70s, you know, back when we were slaves, you know, that was my slave name. And my mother would say, we were not slaves. I'm like, oh, you're having a slave fantasy. Delaware was a slave state.
But one day she came upon the PBS documentary, Whispers of Angels, about the Underground Railroad.
Burris eventually guided them to the home of the young Quaker, John Hunn, in Middletown.
Eventually, he became known as the chief engineer of the Underground Railroad in Delaware. So he was very well known, and people would, that were helping the slaves escape would say, go see John Hunn.
John Hunn helped as many as 200 fugitive slaves make their way to freedom.
John Hunn's father and uncle were the owners of this property. They inherited it in 1794.
Historian Robin Krawitz has studied John Hunn for the past 20 years. She learned that his father, Ezekiel Hunn, also helped runaway slaves escape.
He had funded an African-American boatman to ferry people from here and from the St. Johns River over to New Jersey, which was the closest point of freedom.
His son, however, had other plans as a young man. After training to be a silk merchant, he visited his older sister, Patience, a devout Quaker. She took one look at his fancy clothes and said, "Throw off thy Babylonish garment."
And she basically read him the Riot Act and said, you know, come back to the faith, be who you are. And it took.
John Hunn was 27 years old when he became involved with the Underground Railroad. It was a cold, snow-covered day like this. He was washing his hands at a pump outside his home when he saw an unfamiliar covered wagon approach.
There was a group of people who were escaping enslavement from Queen Anne's County in Maryland, traveling all night in a wagon and on foot. He brought in the women and children into the house, and then the men went out into the barn, and they were all housed and warmed up and fed, and then to get them ready to continue on their journey. John Hunn's house here.
But a neighbor turned them in to the local magistrate. While they eventually made their way to freedom, John Hunn was prosecuted in federal court.
Under the fugitive slave law, it was a federal crime to assist runaway slaves, and slave owners could sue anyone who did so. In this courthouse, John Hunn was brought before Judge Robert Taney. Taney would later write the infamous Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans did not have civil rights protected by the U.S. Constitution.
Well, he didn't contest the charges. He said, yeah, I did it. So he was heavily fined.
Hunn's world fell apart. He lost everything. His family had to move in with relatives, and his 6-year-old son died after a long illness. Still, Hunn steadfastly continued his work.
I think his calling was so strong, and he felt this issue was such an important issue that he didn't feel he could stop.
On his deathbed, Hunn ordered his son to burn all records of his activity in the Underground Railroad. He wrote, "I ask no other reward for any efforts made by me in the cause than to feel that I have been of use to my fellow men. No other course would have brought me peace of mind."
It was a shock. I've used this man's name, who is the southernmost conductor of the Underground Railroad, who remained hidden the same way we do with everything. We think everything is black and white, good and evil, sin and righteous. No. There's so much more to every story if you just look a little further.
And that she did. Determined to set the record straight, Berry wrote The Ties That Bind, a memoir of race, memory, and redemption.
If you had the opportunity to speak to him face to face, what would you say?
To John Hunn? Oh, wow, dude, you are so cool. Thank you. And while the laws are against you now, years from now, everyone will know that you're right.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Still ahead, this couple took a leap of faith in order to spread the gospel. Charlene Aaron returns after the break to share this amazing story. It's coming up right after this. Stay with us.
Welcome back to CBN News Watch. This week on the Prayer Link, for years an Atlanta couple envisioned traveling the country to share the gospel. And that vision recently became a reality after they chose to step out on faith. That meant selling everything they owned, including their home. But they say the mission of reaching the lost is well worth it.
The best thing ever. It was a lot exhausting physically to literally sell and process through giving away, donating, or throwing away or selling all of our stuff. But I think the entire time, even going through the home sale process, we had that hope set before us. The work was worth it, even though it was exhausting, because we knew what God was calling us to by way of freedom, financial freedom, freedom from the weight of things holding us back. And so it was amazing and totally exhausting, but worth it.
It was funny coming home each day and from my job, which I quit, but coming home each day and just different things disappearing. And at some point you're just like, whatever, my wife is selling it all. It's okay.
Now, you guys are now living in your RV full time and you're ministering. How's all of that going? Living in there with the kids and on the road?
It's been beautiful. It's a very physically demanding lifestyle. So I am grateful to have the muscle behind the movement. That's what I call Jeremiah.
It's a lot of work.
It truly is a lot of work, but it's so incredible to realize just how little we actually need. When we have one another, when we have the basics, when we have a mission in mind, you start to realize just how little you really need to live freely and to live in full commitment to the call of God. And so I've been surprisingly refreshed. Our children are so amazing. They're 6 and under, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
And their faith, their excitement, their joy, it makes you realize the stuff really isn't where that's centered. It's in the experience, the adventure, and being together.
I liked what you said also in one of your posts about, you chose surrender over stuff. So it's so powerful. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people. Tell us about the ministry that you guys are doing. What are you seeing God do as you're out there on the road and sharing Jesus with people?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been honestly about half a month, but in the few weeks we've been doing it, just some of the people we've encountered and the stories we've heard, and just the natural organic ways we've gotten to minister to people, and even our kids, you know, getting to meet other kids, and just it's been really incredible, and it's something that's going to keep developing over time.
Watch this week's prayer link to receive the word, encouragement, and prayer. Back to you, Ephraim.
Thanks, Charlene. You can catch Prayer Link on the CBN News Channel this evening at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. You can also download the CBN News app for that. Coming up, a new film brings thousands to Christ. Find out more about it, including how you can watch it for free. We've got the story for you when we come back. Stay with us. More than 200,000 people made the decision to follow Christ after watching a Christian film produced by the Luis Palau Association. The film, called Light Your World, features testimonies, presentations, and Christian music from artists such as Maverick City Music and Toby Mac. The ministry says one of the goals of Light Your World is to share the good news of Jesus Christ with friends and family. And you can do just that by going to lightyourworld.live. There you can watch the film for free. It is time for your Tuesday Tweetable. I pray this message will inspire you and you'll take a moment to post, tag, tweet, and share it with those in your circles of influence. God is not just great, He is greater. Greater than your questions, greater than your fears. He's greater than any mountain you can or cannot see. With that word, make today a terrific Tuesday. That is a wrap for this edition of CBN News Watch. You can always find more of our programs on the CBN News Channel, as well as cbnnews.com. You can find them there at any time. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today. Email us at the address at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Come back. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.